The Evanston house was so pitch black that 72-year-old Arthur could barely see his own hands. His stomach was so empty it felt like it was folding into itself against the bitter Illinois chill. Suddenly, his daughter, Sarah, rushed through the front door and flipped on the harsh overhead light, stopping dead in her tracks. "Dad, why are you sitting in the freezing dark?" she gasped, her eyes darting toward the barren kitchen. "And why is there absolutely no food in this house? You get $12,000 every single month from your pension, so where is it going?" Before the old man could gather the words to defend his pride, his daughter-in-law, Chloe, stepped out from the hallway shadows. With a slow, chilling smile, she looked at Sarah and simply said, "I control every dollar he receives." Arthur watched as Sarah slowly pulled her car keys from her pocket and placed them heavily onto the wooden dining table. When she spoke, it was in a low, dangerous tone he had never heard from her before. "Then today, that control ends." Chloe let out a sharp, condescending laugh that echoed against the cold walls of the living room. She crossed her arms over her expensive cashmere sweater, completely unfazed by the fury radiating from her sister-in-law. "You are being dramatic, Sarah," Chloe said, her voice dripping with fake pity. "Michael and I are simply doing what is best for him. Your father is getting older. He forgets to pay the bills. He leaves the stove on. Someone had to step in and manage his finances before he bankrupted himself." Arthur felt a hot wave of humiliation wash over his chest, tight and suffocating. He wanted to shout that he never left the stove on, that he had managed his money perfectly fine for over 40 years while working at the automotive plant. But the words died in his throat. He looked down at his calloused hands, hands that had built the very porch Chloe was standing on, now trembling with a mixture of cold and profound shame. He was the patriarch, the man who was supposed to be the unbreakable foundation of the Pendleton family. Yet, in his own dining room, he was being discussed as if he were an incompetent child. Why did he remain silent? Because every time he tried to bring up the suffocating budget Chloe imposed on him, Michael would pull him aside, his eyes pleading. Michael would tell him how stressed Chloe was, how delicate their marriage had become, and beg his father to just play along to keep the peace. Arthur loved his son too much to be the wedge that destroyed his home. He had always believed that a father's duty was to sacrifice his own comfort for the sake of his children's happiness. He thought his silence was a shield protecting his family. He did not realize it had become the very cage locking him in the dark. Sarah did not break eye contact with Chloe. She took a step forward, closing the distance between them. "He forgets things," Sarah repeated, her voice deceptively calm. "Is that your excuse for starving him? Does managing his finances mean turning off the heating in the middle of winter? Look at him, Chloe. He is wearing 2 winter coats inside his own house." "Heating is expensive," Chloe snapped, dropping the polite facade. "We are putting his money into secure investments. It is called asset protection. You would understand that if you were around more instead of burying yourself in your hospital shifts." Sarah ignored the insult. She marched straight past Chloe and yanked open the refrigerator door. The dim bulb illuminated empty plastic shelves. There was half a lemon and a single bottle of tap water. She slammed it shut, the sound cracking through the room like a gunshot. "Where is the food budget?" Sarah demanded. "If you are managing his $12,000 a month, where are the groceries? Where is his heart medication? I noticed the empty bottles in the bathroom." Chloe shifted her weight, a flicker of genuine irritation crossing her perfectly manicured features. "I give him cash when he needs it. If he is hungry, he can ask. Michael has legal power of attorney, Sarah. This is none of your business. We are his family too, and we are handling it." "Handling it?" Sarah asked, stepping dangerously close to her sister-in-law. "You are not handling anything. You are suffocating him. And as of this exact second, you are no longer welcome in this house." Chloe scoffed, her eyes widening in disbelief. "You cannot kick me out of my own father-in-law's house." "I just did," Sarah said, pointing a steady finger toward the front door. "Get your coat and get out. Before I call the police and report you for elder abuse." The words hung in the freezing air, heavy and terrifying. Arthur looked up, his heart pounding against his ribs. Elder abuse. The phrase sounded like something that happened to strangers on the evening news, not to a proud man like him. Chloe's face paled slightly, but her pride refused to let her crumble. She grabbed her designer handbag from the armchair, her movements sharp and furious. "Michael is going to hear about this," she hissed, glaring at Sarah. "You are making a massive mistake. You have no idea what you are messing with." "Tell Michael to expect a call from me," Sarah shot back. "Now get out." The heavy oak door slammed shut behind Chloe, leaving a thick, ringing silence in the house. Arthur let out a long, shaky breath he did not know he was holding. He felt exhausted, drained to his very bones. Sarah did not say another word for a long moment. She walked into the kitchen, turned on the gas stove to generate some immediate heat, and then came back to the dining table. She pulled up a chair next to her father, reaching out to take his rough, freezing hands in hers. Her touch was warm, grounding him in the chaotic reality of the night. "Dad," Sarah whispered, the anger draining from her voice, replaced by a deep, aching sadness. "How long has this been going on? How long have you been sitting in the dark?" Arthur swallowed hard, unable to meet her gaze. "I just wanted to help Michael," he murmured, his voice cracking. "He said the business was tough. He said Chloe was good with numbers. I did not want to cause trouble, Sarah. I just wanted peace." "Peace should not cost you your dignity," Sarah said softly, wiping a stray tear from her cheek. "You worked your entire life for us. You sacrificed everything so Michael and I could have a good life. You do not owe them your suffering." Arthur looked around the shadowy room, the walls that held decades of memories with his late wife, the home that was supposed to be his safe haven. For the first time, he realized that by avoiding conflict, he had allowed his own flesh and blood to strip away his humanity piece by piece. Sarah squeezed his hands tightly, forcing him to look her in the eyes. Her gaze was fierce, burning with a protective fire that reminded him so much of her mother. "I am ordering groceries right now," Sarah declared, her tone leaving no room for argument. "And tomorrow morning, you and I are going straight to the bank. We are going to find out exactly where every single penny of your money has gone. I promise you, Dad. We are going to fix this, and we are going to get your life back." Arthur gave a slow, hesitant nod. He was terrified of what they might find, and even more terrified of the storm that was about to hit his family. But as the warmth from the kitchen slowly began to creep into the freezing room, a tiny spark of resolve ignited in his chest. The days of suffering and silence were over. The night dragged on endlessly. Arthur lay awake on his mattress, staring up at the familiar cracks in the plaster ceiling. The house was quiet now, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator that Sarah had stocked just hours ago. But inside his mind, a storm of memories raged, refusing to grant him peace. He pulled the thick woolen blanket up to his chin, feeling the lingering chill in his bones, a chill that had less to do with the Illinois winter and more to do with the freezing reality of his own choices. His thoughts drifted back exactly 2 years. It was the autumn after his mild stroke. He remembered sitting in a sterile hospital room, his left hand still feeling slightly numb, terrified of losing his independence. Michael had walked into that room looking every bit the successful, reliable son. Michael wore a sharp suit, his hair perfectly combed, carrying a leather briefcase. He had sat on the edge of the hospital bed, holding his father's weak hand with genuine tears in his eyes. Michael had brought papers. A power of attorney document. He explained that it was merely a safeguard, a temporary measure to ensure the bills were paid while Arthur focused entirely on his recovery. Arthur had looked at his boy, the son he had worked endless factory shifts to put through college, and felt a swell of pride. He signed the papers without reading the fine print. He trusted his blood. That was his fatal mistake. Arthur turned over in his bed, squeezing his eyes shut as the shame washed over him again. The takeover had not happened overnight. It was a slow, agonizing suffocation engineered perfectly by Chloe. It started with the bank statements disappearing from his mailbox. When he asked about them, Chloe smiled sweetly and said they had gone paperless to save the trees. Then came the restrictions. Last November, when the ancient furnace in the basement started making a terrifying grinding noise before giving out completely, Arthur had called his son for the repair funds. Chloe had answered the phone. She told him replacing the furnace was simply not in the budget. She used big, confusing words about asset allocation and liquidity, insisting they were protecting his wealth. She bought him 2 space heaters instead. But the absolute lowest point, the memory that made Arthur's chest physically ache, was the envelope. A grown man, a proud union worker who had provided for his family his entire life, reduced to begging for scraps. He remembered standing in Chloe's spotless, marble-tiled kitchen, shifting his weight from foot to foot like a reprimanded schoolboy. He had simply asked for a little cash to buy new winter boots and drop a few bills in the Sunday collection plate at his church. Chloe had sighed, rolled her eyes, and reached into her expensive handbag. She pulled out a small, crumpled paper envelope and handed it to him. Inside was exactly $50. She had looked at him with that same condescending smile and told him to make it last the month because times were tough. Arthur had taken the envelope. He had swallowed his pride, walked out into the snow, and wept silently in his car. The smell of brewing coffee pulled Arthur out of his dark reverie. Pale morning light was filtering through the frost-covered windows. He slowly got out of bed, his joints stiff, and made his way to the kitchen. Sarah was already there. She had prepared a full breakfast of eggs, toast, and hot coffee. It was the first real meal he had seen in his own house in months. Before he could even sit down, a sharp ringing shattered the morning peace. It was Sarah's cell phone resting on the kitchen counter. The screen flashed with Michael's name. Sarah did not hesitate. She picked up the device, pressed the speaker button, and set it back down on the counter. Michael did not say hello. His voice exploded through the tiny speaker, laced with a frantic, breathless panic. "Sarah, what the hell do you think you are doing?" Michael yelled. "Chloe came home crying last night. You have absolutely no right to interfere in my household or my financial arrangements with Dad. You are completely out of line." Sarah calmly took a sip of her coffee. She stared at the phone as if it were a venomous snake. "Your financial arrangements," she repeated smoothly. "You mean starving our father? You mean leaving him freezing in the dark while $12,000 a month vanishes into thin air? If that is your arrangement, Michael, then yes, I am interfering. You do not understand business." Michael shouted back, his voice cracking with a desperate edge. Things are complicated right now. The market is volatile. We are protecting his future. If you take him to the bank today, you are going to ruin everything. You are going to destroy this family, Sarah. I am warning you, back off. Cancel the trip to the bank. Do not take him out of that house. Arthur felt his hands begin to shake again. The sheer volume of his son's voice, the raw anger in it, terrified him. For a fleeting second, the old habit of submission flared up. He wanted to tell Sarah to stop, to just let it go, to avoid the conflict. He opened his mouth to speak, to beg his daughter to keep the peace. But Sarah looked at him. Her eyes were not angry at him, they were filled with a profound, unyielding strength. She was fighting the battle he had been too tired to fight. The family is already destroyed, Michael, Sarah said into the phone, her voice dropping to a glacial chill. You destroyed it the day you handed him a $50 allowance from his own pension. We are going to the bank. And if you try to stop us, I will have the police waiting for you in the lobby. Sarah reached forward and ended the call, cutting off Michael's furious protests. The kitchen fell silent again, save for the ticking of the wall clock. She walked over to the coat rack, pulled down Arthur's heavy winter jacket, and held it open for him. Eat your breakfast, Dad, Sarah said gently, though her jaw was set tight with determination. And then we are going to get your life back. Arthur looked at the hot food, then at his daughter. He took a deep breath, pushing the fear deep down into his stomach. He nodded slowly, put his arms through the sleeves of his coat, and prepared to face the truth. The drive to downtown Evanston was suffocatingly quiet. Arthur sat in the passenger seat of Sarah's car, watching the familiar snow-covered streets blur past his window. He had walked these sidewalks for decades, a proud man who paid his mortgage on time and greeted his neighbors with a firm handshake. Now, he felt like a fugitive heading toward an execution. Michael's frantic voice from the phone call still echoed in his ears, a heavy anchor pulling at his chest. They pulled into the parking lot of the First Illinois Bank. The building was an imposing structure of gray stone and tinted glass. Sarah turned off the engine, unbuckled her seatbelt, and turned to him. She did not offer empty comfort. She simply offered her hand. Arthur took a deep breath, pushing down the nausea churning in his stomach, and stepped out into the freezing wind. Inside, the bank was warm and smelled of polished floors and stale coffee. It was a mundane Tuesday morning for everyone else. Tellers smiled at customers, and soft jazz played from the ceiling speakers. For Arthur, the bright lights felt blinding. Sarah approached the front desk with a determined stride. My father needs to see the branch manager immediately, she told the receptionist. It concerns an urgent audit of his retirement accounts. Within 10 minutes, they were ushered into a quiet, glass-walled office. A middle-aged man in a sharp navy suit stood up from behind a heavy mahogany desk. His name tag read Mr. Harrison. He offered a polite, practiced smile. Good morning, Mr. Pendleton, the manager said, gesturing to the leather chairs opposite him. It has been a while since we saw you in the branch. How can I help you and your daughter today? Arthur opened his mouth, but his throat felt lined with sandpaper. Sarah stepped in smoothly. My father would like a complete history of his checking and pension accounts for the past 2 years. We also need to see the exact destination of every withdrawal made under the current power of attorney. Mr. Harrison nodded, though a faint line of confusion appeared on his forehead. Of course. Let me pull up the profile. He typed rapidly on his keyboard, his eyes scanning the screen. The rhythmic clicking of the keys felt like a countdown in the silent office. Suddenly, the typing stopped. Mr. Harrison frowned, leaning closer to his monitor. He clicked the mouse twice, his polite smile fading into a mask of professional concern. The silence stretched, thick and unbearable. "Is there a problem, Mr. Harrison?" Sarah asked, her voice dangerously calm. The manager cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably in his leather chair. "Mr. Pendleton, I am looking at the transaction history since the power of attorney was enacted 24 months ago. It appears there are no internal savings or investment accounts linked to your profile." Arthur felt the blood drain from his face. "No savings," he whispered. "Chloe told me my pension was being put into high-yield retirement funds. $12,000 a month." Mr. Harrison looked at Arthur with a mixture of pity and alarm. "I am sorry, sir. That is not what the records show. Every month, within 48 hours of your pension deposit clearing, the funds were wired out of the bank entirely." "Wired where?" Sarah demanded, leaning forward, her hands flat on the mahogany desk. "To an external corporate account," Mr. Harrison replied, reading directly from the screen. "An entity registered as Pendleton Real Estate Development Company. The authorized signatory on that receiving account is Michael Pendleton." The room started to spin. Arthur gripped the armrests of his chair to keep from falling out of it. Pendleton Real Estate Development Company. That was Michael's business. His son had not been managing his money. His son had been using his life savings as a personal piggy bank. The excuse of tough times was a smokescreen for systematic theft. "I need the total," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "How much money has been transferred out over the last 2 years?" Mr. Harrison typed another command. He stared at the number for a long moment before looking up. "The total outbound transfers amount to just over $280,000. $280,000. The number hit Arthur like a physical blow to the chest. That was his sweat on the factory floor. That was the overtime he worked instead of taking vacations. That was the security he had built to ensure he would never be a burden to anyone. Gone. Swallowed by his own son's vanity. Arthur forced his eyes to focus on the manager. "And what is left?" he asked, his voice trembling so violently he barely recognized it as his own. "What is my current balance today?" Mr. Harrison swallowed hard. He looked down at his keyboard, unable to meet the old man's eyes. $84, sir. $84. Arthur closed his eyes as a single, hot tear escaped and traced the deep wrinkles of his cheek. He had been freezing in the dark, begging for $50 handouts, while his son drained $250,000 to fund a failing corporate image. The betrayal was so absolute, so devastating, that it felt like his heart had simply stopped beating. Sarah did not cry. Her sorrow instantly forged itself into a weapon of cold, precise fury. She stood up, her presence dominating the small office. "I want the account frozen," Sarah ordered. "Right now. Not another dime leaves this bank." Mr. Harrison looked panicked. "Miss Pendleton, I understand your distress, but Michael holds a legal power of attorney. Freezing the account requires a formal fraud claim or a court order. If I freeze an active corporate supply line without warning, the bank could face legal repercussions from the signatory." "Legal repercussions?" Sarah laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "My father is a 72-year-old vulnerable adult. His son has siphoned $280,000 of pension money into a private business account, leaving him with $84 to buy food. That is textbook elder financial abuse. If you do not freeze this account in the next 60 seconds, my next call is to the state regulatory board, and I will personally name this branch in a lawsuit for failing to flag massive, predatory corporate transfers from a senior citizen's account." The manager turned pale. He looked at Arthur, desperate for an out. "Mr. Pendleton, do you authorize this freeze? It will trigger an immediate, mandatory fraud investigation. It will involve the authorities. Once I press this button, I cannot undo the consequences for your son." Arthur thought about the empty refrigerator. He thought about Chloe's condescending smile as she handed him that ripped envelope. He thought about the fear he had lived in, the desperate desire to keep the peace at the cost of his own survival. He looked at Sarah, the daughter who had refused to let him fade away in the shadows. The old, compliant Arthur died in that chair. The father who spoke next was a man who had finally realized his own worth. "Freeze it," Arthur commanded, his voice suddenly steady, loud, and carrying the heavy authority of a lifetime of hard work. "Freeze the account, Mr. Harrison. Let the investigation begin." The manager nodded quickly and began to type. The trap Michael had built was finally locked, but Arthur knew the true war was only just beginning. The glass doors of the First Illinois Bank had barely closed behind them when Sarah felt her coat pocket vibrate. It was her cell phone. The screen lit up with Michael calling, followed immediately by 3 frantic text messages. The financial freeze had taken effect with brutal speed. A bounced transaction on the corporate end must have triggered an automated alert to her brother. Sarah let it ring twice before pressing the green button. She held the phone slightly away from her ear, anticipating the explosion. "What did you just do?" Michael roared. His voice was no longer the calculated, smooth tone of a successful businessman. It was the raw, guttural scream of a cornered animal. "Do you have any idea what you just did? The payroll account is locked. The vendor payments just bounced. You just killed this entire family, Sarah." Arthur stood on the freezing sidewalk, wrapping his thick coat tighter around his frail shoulders. He could hear every word leaking from the phone speaker. A day ago, that level of rage from his son would have sent him retreating into silence. Now, it only hardened the cold knot of betrayal in his stomach. "I did not kill anything," Sarah replied, her voice steady and entirely devoid of sympathy. "I stopped a thief from bleeding our father dry." "You stole $280,000, Michael. You left him with $84. It was an investment." Michael screamed, his breath hitching with panic. "I was going to put it back. We had a deal closing next week. Now the creditors are going to tear me apart, and it is your fault. You need to go back in there and lift the freeze right now, or I swear to God." "Or what?" Sarah interrupted, her eyes narrowing. "You will cut off his heat again. You have nothing left to take from him. Do not ever call my phone again." She ended the call and blocked the number immediately. Taking her father by the arm, she guided him toward the car. The drive back to the Evanston house was tense. The winter sky had turned a bruising shade of purple, mirroring the heavy dread settling over them both. Arthur stared out the window, trying to process the sheer magnitude of the theft. His son was not just struggling. His son was deeply, dangerously compromised. They pulled into the familiar driveway. The neighborhood was quiet, the snow absorbing the sounds of the distant highway. But as they walked up the driveway toward the side entrance, Arthur stopped dead in his tracks. The heavy wooden gate leading to the backyard was unlatched, swinging slightly in the bitter wind. Sarah noticed it too. She instinctively stepped in front of her father, her military training kicking in. "Stay behind me, Dad," she whispered. They moved cautiously along the side of the house. When they reached the back porch, Arthur felt the breath leave his lungs. The back door, a sturdy oak door he had installed himself 30 years ago, was cracked open. The lock casing around the handle was splintered, though would violently pried apart by something heavy like a crowbar. "Do not touch anything," Sarah instructed. She pushed the door open with her foot, her eyes scanning the dim kitchen. The house was dead silent. They moved slowly through the hallway and into the living room. At first glance, everything appeared untouched. The antique silver clock still sat on the mantel. The expensive television was still mounted on the wall. Chloe had not come back to loot the electronics. But as Arthur turned the corner into his small study, his heart plummeted. The room had been ransacked. The heavy metal filing cabinet tucked into the corner of the room was pulled open, its drawers yanked completely off their tracks. Stacks of old tax returns, medical bills, and faded photographs were scattered wildly across the worn carpet. Arthur dropped to his knees, his hands trembling as he sifted through the mess. He knew exactly what he kept in a bottom drawer. It was a thick, fireproof envelope containing the most important documents of his life. The deed, Arthur choked out, his voice barely a whisper. He frantically dug through the scattered papers. Sarah, the deed to the house. The original title. The land survey. They are all gone. Sarah knelt beside him, her face tight with realization. Whoever broke in did not care about stealing items to pawn. They were looking for leverage. They were looking for paper. She stood up and walked back out into the dining room, her eyes scanning every surface. That was when she saw it. Resting perfectly in the center of the polished wooden dining table was a single piece of white printer paper. It was completely out of place in the tidy room. Sarah walked over to it, refusing to touch it with her bare hands. She leaned down to read the message printed in thick, black, block letters. She felt the cold chill run down her spine that had absolutely nothing to do with the winter air. She turned to look at her father, who had just walked into the room, clutching a handful of useless tax receipts. "Dad," Sarah said, her voice unusually quiet. Arthur stepped closer and looked down at the table. The anonymous threat stared back at them, plain and terrifying. "Stop digging right now." This was no longer just a family dispute over a misused pension. Michael was not acting alone, and whoever he was involved with was willing to commit a felony to protect their secrets. The illusion of safety in the Evanston house was shattered forever. The police arrived 20 minutes later. Two uniformed officers walked through the Evanston house, their heavy boots tracking melted snow onto the hardwood floors. They took photographs of the splintered back door and the ransacked study. But without security cameras or eyewitnesses, the typed threatening note was just a piece of paper. The officers filed a standard report for breaking and entering, advised them to change the locks, and left into the freezing night. Arthur sat in his worn armchair, feeling a profound sense of violation. His home, the sanctuary he had worked for 40 years on the Ford assembly line to pay off, had been breached. The missing property deed felt like a missing limb. He felt exposed and entirely vulnerable. Sarah did not sleep that night. She brewed a pot of strong black coffee and set up her laptop at the dining table, right on the exact spot where the threatening note had been resting. As a senior executive at a large Chicago hospital, Sarah spent her days navigating bureaucratic labyrinths, auditing bloated departments, and finding discrepancies that others tried desperately to bury. She possessed a clinical, ruthless efficiency when it came to data. She knew exactly how to follow a paper trail, and she was about to turn that skill against her own brother. Around 2 in the morning, the soft glow of the computer screen illuminated Sarah's tired but fiercely focused face. "Dad, come look at this," she called out, her voice cutting through the silent house. Arthur, who had been resting his eyes on the living room sofa, shuffled over. He leaned over her shoulder, staring at lines of digital text and complex spreadsheets he barely understood. "I pulled the public state records and court dockets for Pendleton Real Estate Development," Sarah explained, her finger tracing a column of red figures. "Michael told you he was just having a slow quarter, right? He told Chloe they were protecting assets for the future. That is a complete and utter lie. The company has not closed a single property deal in 24 months. They have not poured a single foundation, renovated a single kitchen, or sold a single unit." Arthur stared at the screen, his chest tightening with disbelief. "But he drives a luxury car. Chloe wears designer clothes. How is that possible?" "Because they have been living on borrowed time and stolen money," she said, clicking to another tab that displayed a long, depressing list of legal filings. "He is drowning in civil suits. He is being sued by unpaid lumber suppliers, stiffed electricians, and independent contractors. He has defaulted on massive equipment loans. The company is a hollow shell, Dad. It is entirely insolvent." The image of Michael, the successful, polished businessman, shattered completely in Arthur's mind. His son was not a titan of industry. He was a drowning man dragging everyone else down with him. "Then where did my $280,000 go?" Arthur asked, his voice trembling as the reality of the numbers set in. If he was not building anything, and he was not paying his workers, what was he buying with my pension? "That is exactly what I was trying to figure out," Sarah said, her tone dropping to a serious, dangerous register. She opened a digital copy of the transaction ledger they had demanded from the bank manager earlier that day. "Look at the routing details on the largest outbound transfers from Michael's corporate account. The money did not go to construction vendors. It was funneled into a series of obscure limited liability companies registered in Delaware. And every single one of those transfers was authorized by a third-party financial consultant." She pointed to a name typed at the bottom of the digital authorization forms. "Victor Sterling." Arthur frowned, reading the name aloud. It meant nothing to him. But Sarah had already been digging into the dark corners of the internet. "I called a friend of mine who works in corporate compliance downtown," Sarah continued, her eyes locking onto her father. "I woke him up and asked him to run Victor Sterling through their internal system. Dad, this man is not a normal accountant or a wealth manager. He is a crisis liquidator. In the financial underworld, they call men like him vultures." Arthur lowered himself into the chair beside her, his knees suddenly feeling weak. "What does a vulture do?" "When a corrupt business is about to go under, the owners hire men like Sterling to hide their remaining assets before the bankruptcy courts and creditors can seize them," Sarah explained, her voice sharp with disgust. "Sterling creates shell companies, launders the cash, and makes the paper trail disappear completely. He makes sure the executives walk away rich, while the honest creditors and employees are left with absolutely nothing. He takes a massive cut for his services. He operates right on the razor edge of the law, helping white-collar criminals look like unlucky businessmen." The puzzle pieces snapped together in Arthur's mind, forming a picture so ugly it made him nauseous. The realization hit him like a bucket of ice water. The stolen property deed. The ransacked files. The coldly typed threat left on the table. "Michael did not break into this house," Arthur whispered, a new, chilling fear gripping his heart. "Michael is too much of a coward to pry open a heavy oak door with a crowbar. He would never risk getting his hands dirty." "Exactly," Sarah agreed, snapping the laptop shut with a decisive thud. Michael is in way over his head. He brought a professional predator into our family finances to save his own skin and fund his fake lifestyle. And now that we froze the bank account this morning, we did not just cut off Michael. We cut off Victor Sterling. Sarah stood up, looking toward the dark hallway. That note was not a warning from an angry son throwing a tantrum. It was a calculated threat from a desperate criminal who just realized his easiest payday is slipping away. The facade of a simple family disagreement had completely crumbled to dust. Arthur realized he was no longer dealing with a misguided son and a greedy daughter-in-law. He had unwittingly stepped into a ring with a monster, and his own flesh and blood had held the door open for it. The pale morning sun had barely crested the bare oak trees outside when the screech of tires tore through the quiet Evanston neighborhood. Arthur was still sitting at the dining table, staring blankly at the splintered wood of the back door that Sarah had temporarily wedged shut with a heavy chair. He had not slept a single minute. His mind was a chaotic loop of betrayal, shell companies, and the terrifying name of Victor Sterling. Heavy, frantic pounding erupted at the front door. The blows were so violent they rattled the frosted glass panes. Sarah stood up immediately, her posture rigid. She walked to the entryway and pulled open the heavy wooden door. Michael and Chloe stumbled into the foyer, bringing a blast of freezing wind with them. The transformation in their appearance was shocking. Just 24 hours ago, Chloe had stood in this very house wrapped in cashmere, radiating arrogant authority. Today, her designer coat was hastily buttoned over pajamas, her hair was unkempt, and her face was pale and blotchy from crying. Michael looked even worse. He wore the same crumpled dress shirt from the day before, his tie missing, his eyes bloodshot and rimmed with dark, terrified circles. He looked like a man who had just looked over the edge of a cliff and realized he was falling. Michael did not even acknowledge his sister. He pushed past Sarah and practically fell into the dining room. When he saw Arthur sitting at the table, his knees buckled. He dropped to the hardwood floor right at his father's feet. For a fleeting, desperate second, the old Arthur hoped his son was finally breaking down to apologize. He hoped Michael was kneeling to beg for forgiveness for the stolen $280,000 and the months of deliberate starvation. But as Michael reached out and grabbed the fabric of Arthur's trousers, the illusion shattered. "Dad, you have to stop this," Michael pleaded, his voice a pathetic, wheezing gasp. "You have to call the bank manager right now. Tell him it was a misunderstanding. Tell him to lift the freeze and cancel the fraud alert. Please, Dad. You have to save me." Arthur looked down at the top of his son's head, feeling a profound, sickening emptiness in his chest. "Save you?" Arthur repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "You stole my life savings, Michael. You left me in the dark with $84. And now you want me to protect you from the consequences?" Chloe stepped forward, wringing her hands together so tightly her knuckles were white. "Arthur, you do not understand," she cried, her voice pitching into hysteria. "If that account stays frozen, the creditors will completely destroy us. We will lose our cars. We will lose our country club memberships. We will have to declare personal bankruptcy. We will have absolutely nothing." Sarah let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "Oh, the horror. You might have to actually get jobs and pay for your own groceries. Cry me a river, Chloe. My father is not withdrawing the investigation. We know everything. We know about the lawsuits. We know the development company has been dead for 2 years. And we know all about your vulture friend, Victor Sterling." Hearing that name made the remaining color drain completely from Michael's face. He let go of Arthur's trousers and slumped back onto his heels. He looked up at his sister with wide, terrified eyes. "If you know about Victor, then you know you cannot win this," Michael whispered, panic completely consuming him. "Victor is not just an accountant. He represents private lenders. Hard money lenders, Sarah. Dangerous people. They gave us a massive bridge loan to keep the company afloat while Victor moved the assets. The $280,000 from Dad's pension was just to pay the interest." Sarah crossed her arms, standing like a sentinel beside her father. "Then let them take your fake company, Michael. That is your problem, not his." Michael shook his head frantically, fresh tears spilling down his cheeks. "No. No, you do not understand. They did not want the company. The company is worthless." He swallowed hard, his eyes darting away from his father's face. To secure the bridge loan, Victor needed tangible, high-value collateral. Something completely paid off. Something with pure equity. A suffocating silence descended upon the dining room. Arthur felt his heart stop beating. The ransacked study. The missing paper from the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet. The realization clawed its way up his throat, choking him. "Michael," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, deadened tone. "What did you do?" Michael began to sob, burying his face in his hands. "I had power of attorney, Dad. Victor handled the paperwork. He said it was just a formality. He said we would pay it back before anyone ever noticed." "What did you do?" Arthur roared, the sudden explosion of volume startling both Sarah and Chloe. "I mortgaged this house." Michael screamed back, tears and saliva coating his chin. "I used the house as collateral for the loan. If the bank freeze stays in place, the payments stop. If the payments stop, Victor's lenders will trigger the default clause. They will foreclose on this property in less than 30 days. They will throw you out on the street, Dad. You will be completely homeless." Arthur stopped breathing. The room began to spin. This house was the only true thing he had left in the world. He had carried his bride over this exact threshold 45 years ago. He had measured Michael and Sarah's heights on the kitchen doorframe. He had planted the oak tree in the front yard. Every drop of sweat he had ever shed on the factory floor was poured into the foundation of this home. And his son had secretly traded it away to a criminal to fund a life of luxury and lies. Chloe fell to her knees next to her husband, grabbing Arthur's cold, trembling hand. "Please, Arthur," she begged, tears ruining her face. "Just lift the freeze. Let Victor finish his work. If you let the investigation go forward, you lose the house. You lose everything. Please, just sign the papers to stop the bank." Arthur sat entirely frozen in his chair, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. His own son had not just stolen his past and his present. He had sold his future to a monster, and now, the monster was coming to collect. The heavy silence following Michael's confession was suddenly shattered by the doorbell. It was not the frantic pounding Michael had used. It was a single, sharp, deliberate chime that echoed through the tense hallway. Sarah exchanged a dark look with her father before marching toward the foyer. When she opened the heavy oak door, the bitter winter wind swept in, carrying with it the distinct scent of expensive cologne. A man stepped over the threshold, wiping his pristine leather shoes on the welcome mat with infuriating calmness. Victor Sterling looked exactly as Sarah had imagined. He was in his mid-50s, dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit that easily cost more than Arthur made in an entire year at the factory. His silver hair was perfectly styled, and his eyes held the cold, detached calculation of a predator evaluating its prey. "Good morning," Victor said, his voice smooth and completely devoid of any real warmth. He did not wait for an invitation. He walked straight into the dining room, his gaze sweeping over the weeping Chloe and a broken Michael before finally resting on Arthur. "You must be Arthur. I am Victor Sterling. I believe my name has already come up this morning." Sarah stepped immediately between Victor and her father. "Get out of this house," she ordered, her voice laced with pure venom. "You are trespassing, and the police have already been here once today." Victor offered a thin, patronizing smile. He slowly unbuttoned his suit jacket and placed his sleek leather briefcase on the dining table, right next to the spot where the anonymous threat had rested hours earlier. "I am not here to cause trouble, Sarah. I am here to clean up the mess your brother made. And quite frankly, I am the only person currently standing between your family and absolute ruin." "You caused the ruin," Sarah fired back. "You helped him launder $280,000 of a 72-year-old man's pension. I provided financial consultation to a failing corporate entity," Victor corrected smoothly, not a single hint of panic in his voice. "Michael signed the authorizations. Michael held the power of attorney. The legal liability rests entirely on his shoulders. Which brings us to exactly why I am here." Victor snapped the gold latches of his briefcase open. The sound cracked like a whip in the quiet room. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, bound by a dark blue cover, and slid them across the polished wood toward Arthur. "The freeze you initiated at the bank this morning triggered an automatic default notice with my associates," Victor explained, his cold eyes locking onto Arthur. "My associates are private lenders. They do not operate like traditional banks. They do not send polite letters, and they do not wait. When they feel their capital is threatened, they seize the collateral immediately. The collateral is the very floor you are sitting on." Arthur stared down at the documents. The bold letters at the top read "Irrevocable Deed of Trust and Transfer of Property." His stomach twisted into a painful, suffocating knot. "Here is the reality of your situation, Arthur," Victor continued, his tone turning surgical and precise. "If you leave that bank freeze in place and proceed with a fraud investigation, two things will inevitably happen. First, my associates will execute the foreclosure clause. You will be violently evicted from this house in less than 14 days. Second, the federal authorities will trace the funds. When they do, your son will be indicted for elder financial abuse, wire fraud, and embezzlement. He is looking at a minimum of 15 years in a federal penitentiary." Michael let out a muffled, agonizing sob, burying his face in Chloe's shoulder. The sound disgusted Arthur, yet it simultaneously tugged at the deepest, most vulnerable strings of his paternal heart. Victor leaned forward, placing a heavy silver pin on top of the documents. "But there is an alternative. You sign these papers right now. You voluntarily transfer the deed of this house to my private equity trust. In exchange, I will personally satisfy the debt with the lenders. I will restructure Michael's remaining corporate liabilities, and the paper trail regarding your pension will completely vanish. No foreclosure. No police. No prison for your son." The silence in the room became incredibly heavy. The psychological trap was set flawlessly. Victor was not just stealing Arthur's home, he was using Arthur's unconditional love for his son as the exact weapon to do it. "You are asking me to give you my home to save the thief who stole it," Arthur said, his voice a gravelly, trembling whisper. "I am offering you a choice," Victor corrected softly. "A father's choice. You can keep your pride, pursue justice, and watch your only son rot in a concrete cell while you end up in a state-funded nursing home. Or, you can sign the paper, let the house go, and keep your family out of the tabloids and the prison system. It is a steep price, Arthur. But freedom always is. Sarah grabbed the silver pin and threw it across the room. It shattered against the far wall, ink spilling over the baseboards. "Do not listen to a single word he says, Dad. This is blatant extortion. He is terrified of the federal investigation." Victor did not even flinch. He casually reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a second, identical silver pin, and placed it exactly where the first one had been. He looked down at Arthur, his gaze heavy with ultimate, unyielding authority. "Your daughter is brave, Arthur, but she is thinking with her anger, not her logic," Victor said quietly. "Look at your son. Look at the boy you raised. Are you really willing to send him to federal prison over a house?" Arthur looked past the polished predator standing at his table. He looked at Michael, trembling on the floor, incapable of making eye contact, completely pathetic and broken. The weight of the silver pin resting on the documents felt like 1,000 pounds. The ultimate sacrifice was sitting right in front of him, waiting for his signature. Arthur stared at the silver pin resting on the polished mahogany. It reflected the pale winter light filtering through the frosted windows. For 72 years, he had believed that a father's ultimate duty was to absorb the pain so his children would not have to. He had swallowed his pride when Michael asked for the power of attorney. He had endured the freezing nights. He had accepted the humiliating $50 allowances. He had done it all because he thought keeping the peace was the exact same thing as keeping his family together. But as he looked down at Michael, still cowering on the hardwood floor and hiding behind the tailored suit of a corporate vulture, a profound and terrible clarity washed over Arthur. His endless sacrifices had not forged a strong, honorable man. His silence had not protected his son. His silence had enabled a coward. His willingness to avoid conflict had provided the exact fertile ground for Michael's vanity to mutate into pure greed and eventually into a federal crime. Victor Sterling checked his gold wristwatch, projecting an aura of absolute boredom. He clearly believed the old man was thoroughly broken. Chloe let out a shaky breath of anticipated relief, already preparing to return to her life of stolen luxury. Arthur reached out with his right hand. His knuckles were swollen with arthritis, his skin scarred from decades of pulling heavy levers at the automotive assembly plant. He wrapped his rough fingers around the cold, smooth metal of the silver pin. Michael looked up, his bloodshot eyes wide with desperate gratitude. He thought he was safe. He thought his father was going to rescue him one last time. Arthur did not lower the pin to the signature line. Instead, he placed it back down on the table with a sharp, deliberate click. Then, he picked up the thick stack of legal documents. He gripped the blue cover with both hands, his muscles tensing under his heavy winter coat. With a sudden, violent motion that shocked everyone in the room, Arthur ripped the irrevocable deed of trust straight down the middle. The sound of tearing thick parchment was deafening in the quiet dining room. He stacked the torn halves together and ripped them again, letting the ruined pieces flutter down onto the polished wood. Chloe screamed, jumping back as if the paper were on fire. Michael scrambled backward, his mouth hanging open in pure, unadulterated horror. Even Victor Sterling lost his icy composure. His eyes widened, his jaw tightening into a hard line of genuine shock. No one had ever defied him like this. He was used to dealing with desperate people who always chose the path of least resistance. Arthur stood up. He pushed his chair back, his posture straightening. He no longer looked like the frail, freezing old man who had sat in the dark the night before. The patriarch of the Pendleton family had returned, carrying the heavy, unyielding dignity of a man who had earned everything he owned with his own 2 hands. He looked directly into Victor Sterling's predatory eyes. "You think you can walk into my home and hold my love for my son hostage?" Arthur's voice was deep, resonating with a power that shook the very walls of the room. "You think I am going to sign away the house I built with my dead wife just so you can keep laundering money for cowards? You came to the wrong house." Victor's face flushed with anger. He pointed a perfectly manicured finger at Arthur. "You foolish old man. You just signed your son's arrest warrant. You just threw him into a federal penitentiary." Arthur turned his gaze down to Michael. His son was trembling uncontrollably, weeping openly on the floor. The sight broke Arthur's heart into a million irreparable pieces, but the time for coddling was over. "I love you, Michael," Arthur said, his voice cracking slightly before hardening into steel. "I have loved you since the day you were born. But I will not let you destroy my soul to save your own skin. You made these choices. You stole from me. You brought this criminal into my home. And now, you are going to stand up like a man and face the consequences of your own actions. I will not be your pawn anymore." Michael let out a wail of absolute despair, burying his face in the carpet. Chloe backed away toward the hallway, realizing that her entire world of country clubs and designer clothes had just evaporated into thin air. Sarah stepped forward, her eyes shining with unshed tears of immense pride. She looked at her father, seeing the strong, honorable man she had always known he was. She did not waste another second. She pulled her cell phone from her pocket. Victor Sterling quickly grabbed his briefcase, his professional demeanor entirely shattered. "You are making a catastrophic mistake," he hissed, backing toward the front door. "When the lenders come for this property, they will not knock politely." "Let them come," Sarah said coldly. She tapped the screen of her phone, dialing the direct line to the Chicago field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. She put the phone on speaker and set it on the table, right next to the shredded pieces of the extortion contract. The line rang twice before a stern, professional voice answered. "Federal Bureau of Investigation, White Collar Crime Division. How can I direct your call?" Sarah looked Victor dead in the eyes as he froze with his hand on the doorknob. "My name is Sarah Pendleton," she said clearly and without a single tremor in her voice. "I am calling to report a massive, ongoing financial fraud, the embezzlement of $280,000 from a senior citizen, and an active extortion attempt taking place in my father's home right now. The primary suspects are Michael Pendleton and a financial consultant named Victor Sterling. Send your agents immediately." Victor Sterling did not wait for the federal dispatcher to finish her sentence. The polished, untouchable facade of the corporate liquidator vanished instantly, replaced by the panicked urgency of a cornered criminal. He grabbed his designer briefcase, his knuckles turning white, and practically sprinted out of the front door, disappearing into the freezing Illinois morning. Michael remained curled on the hardwood floor, weeping uncontrollably, while Chloe pressed her back against the hallway wall as if the house itself had suddenly become toxic. Within 30 minutes, 2 dark sedans pulled into the snowy driveway. The authorities had arrived, and a long, agonizing illusion of the Pendleton family was officially over. The weeks that followed were a grueling, exhausting marathon of legal depositions, forensic accounting, and harsh public realities. Sarah took an extended leave of absence from her hospital administration job, refusing to leave her father's side for a single moment. The federal investigation moved with terrifying, surgical precision. Federal agents raided the downtown offices of Pendleton Real Estate Development, confiscating hard drives, ledgers, and boxes of fabricated invoices. But the real prize of the investigation was Victor Sterling. By aggressively tracking the $280,000 stolen from Arthur's pension, investigators unraveled a massive, sophisticated money laundering network. Victor had been using dozens of failing businesses and desperate executives to shield millions of dollars from legitimate creditors. Arthur's stolen money was just a single thread, but pulling it had unraveled Victor's entire criminal empire. The man who had stood in Arthur's dining room and threatened him with homelessness was now facing decades behind bars. As the legal net tightened, the brittle foundation of Michael's marriage shattered completely. The bank accounts were permanently frozen. The luxury cars were repossessed by the leasing companies in the middle of the night, towed away from their upscale suburban driveway while the neighbors watched. When the terrifying reality set in that there would be no miraculous financial rescue and no more country club dinners, Chloe did not offer her husband comfort or loyalty. She simply packed her expensive luggage. On a bleak Tuesday afternoon, she handed Michael a manila envelope containing divorce papers, called a taxi, and walked out of his life without shedding a single tear. She had married an image of wealth, and with that image utterly destroyed, she had absolutely no use for the broken, bankrupt man left behind. The most terrifying battle for Arthur, however, was the fight to save the Evanston house. Victor's associates, the ruthless private lenders, initially threatened to proceed with the foreclosure, hovering like vultures over the property. They sent intimidating legal notices, demanding immediate payment for the defaulted bridge loan. But Sarah was relentless. She hired a ferocious civil litigation attorney who specialized exclusively in elder financial abuse. The legal showdown took place in a crowded county courthouse. Arthur had to sit quietly in the wooden pews, his hands folded in his lap, watching his private family tragedy play out in the public record. His attorney systematically dismantled the legality of the power of attorney document. He proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Michael had engaged in predatory self-dealing, failing his fundamental fiduciary duty to act in his father's best interest. The attorney argued that because the private lenders had knowingly accepted a fraudulently pledged asset, orchestrated by a financial consultant now under federal indictment, their claim to the property was invalid. Faced with the threat of being pulled into the massive federal racketeering case against Victor Sterling, the private lenders folded. The judge ruled the mortgage contract completely null and void. The lien was officially struck from the county records. The house, with all its decades of memories, the porch Arthur had built, and the oak tree he had planted, belonged solely to him once again. Michael eventually pleaded guilty to federal charges of wire fraud and embezzlement. By cooperating fully with the authorities to ensure Victor Sterling received the maximum prison sentence, Michael avoided the harshest penalties, but his life as he knew it was reduced to ashes. He was a convicted felon, legally bankrupt, and entirely alone. The destruction of the Pendleton family unit was absolute and undeniable. Relatives whispered at gatherings, old neighbors stared a little too long at the grocery store, and the silence in the Evanston house often felt heavier than it ever had before. Yet, as Arthur sat by the living room window watching the last of the winter snow melt away into the spring mud, he realized a profound truth. The destruction had been entirely necessary. The disease of pride, cowardice, and deception had been brutally excised from their lives. It was a painful, traumatic surgery that left deep, permanent scars on everyone involved. But as Arthur took a deep breath of the crisp morning air, feeling the undeniable weight of his own restored dignity, he knew one thing for certain. For the first time in over 2 years, the patient was finally going to survive. The calendar turned, bringing another bitter Illinois winter to the quiet, snow-covered streets of Evanston. But inside the old, familiar house, the atmosphere was entirely transformed. The crushing, freezing darkness of the previous year was completely gone. Every room was bathed in warm, golden light. The broken furnace in the basement had been replaced with a brand new system, humming a steady, comforting rhythm that chased away the winter chill. In the kitchen, the refrigerator hummed quietly, fully stocked with fresh meats, vegetables, and warm soups. The monthly pension of $12,000 was flowing safely into an independent, highly secure account that only Arthur and his newly appointed fiduciary attorney could access. Arthur sat at the dining room table, the very table where his world had nearly ended, sharing a hot, homemade meal with his daughter Sarah. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. It was a timid, hesitant sound. Sarah stood up immediately, her protective instincts flaring, but Arthur raised a gentle hand. He walked to the front door himself. When he opened it, the freezing wind rushed in, framing the silhouette of a man standing alone on the porch. It was Michael. Arthur barely recognized his own son. The tailored, expensive suits and the arrogant posture were completely gone. Michael wore a faded, heavy canvas work jacket over a plain gray sweater. His hands, once soft and perfectly manicured, were rough, calloused, and stained with dirt. He looked exhausted, older, and deeply humbled. He was working as a day laborer for a local moving company, loading heavy furniture onto trucks for minimum wage just to survive. Michael did not try to step inside the warm house. He stood shivering on the porch, his breath pluming in the cold air. "Dad," Michael said, his voice quiet and completely devoid of any excuses. "I am not here to ask for anything. I just came to look you in the eye and say I am so incredibly sorry. I was arrogant. I was a coward. I let my pride turn me into a monster, and I almost destroyed the only two people who ever truly loved me." He reached into his worn jacket pocket and pulled out a small, plain white envelope. He handed it to his father with trembling hands. "It is only $200. I picked up some extra overtime shifts this week. I know it does not even begin to make a dent in the $280,000 I stole from you. But I am going to bring you an envelope every single month. Even if it takes me the rest of my natural life, I am going to pay you back." Arthur looked down at the envelope. It was a sharp, heartbreaking contrast to the humiliating $50 handouts Chloe used to give him. He looked back up at his son's raw, honest face. The intense anger that had burned inside Arthur for months finally softened, replaced by a profound, weary grace. "I forgive you, Michael," Arthur said softly. "You are my son, and I will always love you." Michael let out a choked sob, a massive wave of relief washing over his tired features. He took a hopeful step forward. But Arthur gently held up his hand, stopping him right there on the porch. "I forgive you," Arthur repeated firmly. "But trust is not a right. It is something you threw away, and it is something you have to rebuild from the ground up through your actions. You are not welcome at this dinner table tonight. But keep working hard, keep telling the absolute truth, and maybe one day, there will be an empty chair for you here." Michael nodded slowly, understanding and accepting the heavy, necessary boundary. He turned and walked away into the falling snow, carrying the weight of his redemption. Arthur closed the door, locking it securely, and returned to the warmth of his home and his daughter. The story of Arthur Pendleton is more than just a family tragedy. It is a profound lesson about the true nature of love, respect, and boundaries. For decades, Arthur believed that silence was the ultimate form of sacrifice. He thought that by avoiding conflict and hiding his own pain, he was protecting his family from breaking apart. But true peace cannot be built on a foundation of silent suffering. Blind trust is not love. Letting someone exploit your kindness does not make them a better person, it only enables their worst behavior to flourish. The bravest thing you can ever do is stand up for your own dignity, even when the person tearing it down is someone you love with all your heart. Setting clear boundaries is not an act of betrayal. It is an act of profound self-respect and the only way to truly protect the people you care about from losing their way. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever found yourself staying silent to keep the peace, only to realize that your kindness was being completely taken advantage of by those closest to you? Please share your thoughts and relate this story to your own real-life experiences in the comments section below. We truly want to hear the feelings straight from the bottom of your heart. If you found value and meaning in this story, please press the subscribe button on our channel, like this video, and share it with your friends and family so we can continue bringing you attractive, emotional, and powerful videos every single day. We sincerely wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life every day, and absolute peace of mind. Goodbye and see you in the next video.